Christopher Nolan made Warner Bros. Billions of dollars. The Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, Dunkirk, Tenet. For nearly 20 years, he was their golden boy. So why did he walk away from the studio that made him one of the most powerful directors in Hollywood? Today we're talking about one of the biggest breakups in Hollywood history, Christopher Nolan and Warner Bros. And look, I get it. On the surface, this sounds like boring studio business. A director left a studio, big deal. Except for nearly 2 decades, Nolan and Warner Bros. Were basically inseparable, and their partnership produced some of the biggest movies of the modern era. Then suddenly, it was over. So what actually happened? Who was right? Who was wrong? And why are we still feeling the effects of this years later? Let's get into it. Before we get to the breakup, we need to understand how important this relationship actually was. Because most directors spend their careers fighting studios over budgets and creative control. That's just how Hollywood works. Christopher Nolan was different. After Memento turned heads in 2000, Warner Bros. Took a chance on him, starting a relationship that lasted 19 years. Then came Batman Begins, then The Dark Knight, which became one of the most influential films ever made, not just in the superhero genre, but period. From that point on, Nolan became one of the rare directors whose name alone could sell tickets. The Dark Knight trilogy made billions. Inception became a cultural phenomenon. Interstellar became a modern classic. Dunkirk earned Oscar nominations, and by the second decade of this relationship, the numbers reflected just how valuable he'd become. Nolan was commanding a $20 million upfront salary plus a cut of the gross earnings. Not net profits, gross. On Dunkirk, that deal alone earned him north of $100 million in bonuses when the film made $530 million worldwide. Nolan got creative freedom. Warner Bros. Got massive profits. From the outside, it looked perfect. Picture 2019. Streaming is exploding, Netflix is dominant, Disney Plus just launched, and every studio is scrambling to figure out their future, including Warner Bros. At this point, Nolan is one of the loudest defenders of theatrical releases. This isn't a marketing position for him. He genuinely believes movies belong on giant screens with an audience, and he's been consistent about that for years. Then 2020 hits. The pandemic shuts down theaters worldwide. Studios panic. Billions of dollars sit trapped in unreleased films, and nobody knows what to do. Tenet was the first major film to return to theaters after the pandemic. Theaters were just beginning to reopen, and Nolan was committed to preserving the theatrical experience. Warner Bros. Needed convincing to release the film so early in the pandemic, but Nolan eventually persuaded them. Nolan didn't just make a movie during the pandemic. He convinced an entire studio to bet on theaters reopening when nobody knew if audiences would show up. He insisted on an exclusive theatrical release and got one, a traditional rollout that predated the studio's later streaming strategy entirely. He even waived certain fees to help make that release happen. He put his own money behind the thing he believed in. So, how did it perform? Tenet earned around $350 million worldwide, which actually resulted in a $50 million loss for Warner Bros. On its $205 million budget. In the US alone, it only made $57.6 million. It performed better internationally, particularly in China, where it grossed $66 million, more than its entire US run. That underwhelming domestic performance is thought to have partly shaped what Warner Bros. Did next. December 3rd, 2020. Warner Bros. Announces that every single one of their 2021 movies will release simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max. The same day, not weeks or months later. Dune, The Matrix Resurrections, Godzilla vs. Kong, The Suicide Squad, all of it, available immediately on a streaming service. At the time, it was nuclear. Agents, actors, and filmmakers across Hollywood were furious, and Christopher Nolan was the most vocal of all. The reason goes deeper than the streaming decision itself. The producers, directors, and stars behind Warner's entire 2021 slate were reportedly blindsided by the announcement, finding out alongside the public. That's where the trust broke. Not because Warner Bros. Chose streaming, because of how they handled it. And there was a financial dimension too. Compensation for these films was typically tied to theatrical box office performance. Reports at the time suggested talent on Wonder Woman. 1984 would receive tens of millions for the HBO Max release, but filmmakers on Warner's other 2021 movies might not see the same level of compensation. Warner Brothers didn't just change where movies would be seen, they turned theatrical releases, the foundation these filmmakers' deals were built on, into what Nolan called a loss leader for a struggling streaming service without any consultation. For someone like Nolan with the kind of gross points deal that earned him over $100 million on Dunkirk alone, this wasn't just philosophical. It was personal, and it was financial. He did not stay quiet. Days after the announcement, Nolan went public. He told E! His response was disbelief, saying, "There's such controversy around it because they didn't tell anyone. They've got some of the top filmmakers in the world. They've got some of the biggest stars in the world who worked for years in some cases on these projects very close to their hearts that are meant to be big screen experiences. And now they're being used as a loss leader for the streaming service, without any consultation." But the line that made headlines was the one he gave The Hollywood Reporter. Some of our industry's biggest filmmakers and most important movie stars went to bed the night before working for the greatest movie studio, and woke up to find out they were working for the worst streaming service. The greatest movie studio. The worst streaming service. Same sentence, same company. He went further, saying, "Warner Brothers don't even understand what they're losing. Their decision makes no economic sense, and even the most casual Wall Street investor can see the difference between disruption and dysfunction." Remember Tenet, the movie Nolan fought so hard to protect? The one that cost Warner Bros. $50 million? Less than a year after Nolan called HBO Max the worst streaming service in headlines around the world, Tenet itself landed on HBO Max. May 1st, 2021, just 3 months after his public criticism. The movie Nolan personally protected from streaming, the one he convinced Warner Bros. To release theatrically during a global pandemic, the one he waived fees for, ended up on the exact platform he had just publicly torched. HBO Max even tweeted about it, joking, "Good news for anyone experiencing time linearly," a nod to Tenet's plot. Whether that's Warner Brothers trolling him or just standard practice once a theatrical window closes, the timing is brutal. So, what happened next? Nolan started talking to multiple studios about his next project. A World War II drama about J. Robert Oppenheimer with a $100 million budget. Sony and MGM were both interested. He did have talks with Warner Brothers, but the relationship had grown strained. The studio unhappy with his public comments, Nolan upset about the HBO Max decision. In September 2021, it was confirmed. Oppenheimer would be made by Universal, the first time in nearly 2 decades Nolan hadn't made a film for Warner Brothers. There's one more twist. In April 2022, Warner Brothers announced their big 2023 film, Barbie, would release the exact same day as Oppenheimer, July 2023. While Nolan declined to speculate about the timing, many believed Warner Brothers was trying to hurt Oppenheimer's box office by counter-programming against their former golden boy. If that was the plan, it backfired completely. Oppenheimer made $948 million at the box office. Nolan's biggest international hit ever, and it swept the Oscars including Best Picture and his first ever Best Director win. Barbenheimer became one of the biggest box office events in cinema history, and the rivalry that may have created it came from Warner Brothers itself. Meanwhile, Warner Brothers reportedly wrote Nolan a 7-figure check, returning the Tenet fees he'd previously waived, a goodwill gesture to repair the relationship. But Nolan turned down millions to return to Warner Brothers for his next project, despite that 7-figure offer, and stuck with Universal instead. for a film reportedly starring Matt Damon, expected to release in 2026. Here's what stands out to me about this whole story. Warner Brothers wasn't wrong to be scared in 2020. Every studio was, and the entire business model of cinema was collapsing in real time. Somebody had to make hard calls. But making that call without telling the people whose careers, paychecks, and bodies of work were built on the model they were dismantling, that's not a pandemic decision. That's a communication failure. And it cost them one of the most bankable directors in the history of the medium. Nolan has since called the feud water under the bridge and said he'd be open to working with Warner Bros. Again. So this isn't a permanent grudge. But it took an Oscar sweep, a billion-dollar movie, and a literal check from Warner Brothers to get back to water under the bridge. And the real irony is this. Nolan went to war over theatrical experiences and creative respect, and ended up making the biggest film of his career for a studio he'd never worked with before, about a man who also built something he couldn't fully control. So that's the real story of why Christopher Nolan left Warner Brothers. A trust built over 19 years broken in a single afternoon, over a decision nobody saw coming. Was Warner Brothers just trying to survive a pandemic? Or did they make one of the worst business decisions in modern Hollywood history? Let me know what you think. If you want more of these Hollywood deep dives, subscribe. See you in the next one.